You're watching Huff Post Live. I'm Ricky Camilleri. If you're straight, you're attracted to the opposite sex. If you're gay, you're attracted to the same sex. And if you're bisexual, you're attracted to everyone. But what if you don't experience sexual attraction at all? If that's the case, you're asexual or an ace, as those in the community refer to themselves. That was not a condescending quote. It was a quote. Here to break down what asexuality is, what it isn't, and whether the community falls under the LGBTQ umbrella, I'm joined by Huff Post's Dominique Mossbergen, who wrote a 6-part series for the Huffington Post on asexuality, David J., founder of the Asexuality Visibility and Education Network, Julie Decker, an asexual activist, Lori Brado, a clinical psychologist who has researched asexuality, and Micah R., an asexual and transgender advocate. Everyone, thank you so much for joining me to have this conversation. Dominique, first off, you wrote a very robust 6-part series about asexuality for the Huffington Post. What inspired this?
Well, you know, when I was thinking about, I wanted to really delve into a very broad topic that would resonate and that would be powerful and meaningful to our readers. And so we decided to kind of explore the asexual community a little bit because we realized that there was so little out there. I mean, it was kind of shocking how little there was out there, not just in scientific literature, but also covered by the mass media. I mean, there was so little information, and we felt that there was also this general ignorance among not just our readers, but also just the general public about asexuals and the asexual community. So we thought that, we would be able to maybe break some boundaries, start asking some really important questions, and start a discussion about asexuality. I mean, even though, as you said, it was pretty robust. I mean, it was longer than we had initially anticipated.
I mean, you dived into many sort of subtopics about asexuality. It's a fascinating piece.
Thank you. I mean, it's a 6-part series. We tried very hard to provide a really candid, but unbiased and well-rounded overview, but it's kind of just an introduction. And we wanted to, as I said earlier, just kind of spark a debate.
So David, how do you define asexuality?
An asexual person is someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction. So most people, whether they're walking down the street or they're in a close relationship with someone, have an intrinsic desire to make sexuality a part of that relationship, and asexual people don't. Other than that, we have the same desire for intimacy and connection that everyone else has. And it's also a spectrum. There are people who are very highly sexual. There are people who have experienced no sexual attraction. And in between, there are people who identify as gray A or demisexual, people who experience only occasional sexual attraction, who experience sexual attraction only in the context of a really intimate relationship.
How did you come to embrace the label yourself?
So I remember being in my teens, being 13 or 14, and all of my friends sort of talking about exploring their sexuality. And that whole experience felt alien to me. I didn't have a way that I could relate it to my own experience. And that was really scary. It was scary to grow up in a world that kind of expected me to be sexual and really expected sexuality to be the way that I was going to connect with people. And not know what it was going to be like to not do that. I was afraid I wasn't going to be able to connect with people. I was afraid that there was something wrong with me, that I was broken. And the word asexual really came out of my own struggle to figure out how to make sense of that.
Julie, Micah, I'm curious how you came to define yourself as asexual, what your stories are. Julie, if you could tell us how you came to define yourself as asexual.
I actually called myself non-sexual for many years. I invented that term myself when I was about 15 years old in high school, and I wasn't attracted to my boyfriend. And I didn't start using asexual until after David J. created the Asexual Visibility and Education Network, and that just became the term that everyone was using. So I just adopted it to connect myself to everyone else.
Well, I think what's so interesting about asexuality, and I don't want to trivialize anything at all, but I think it's hard for people to understand not having any sort of sexual feelings, considering that sexuality seems like such an intrinsic part of who people are, something that you don't even have to think about sometimes.
Definitely. I mean, I think that's what's very interesting about, for me anyway, as a sexual person. I think I'd never really thought about my sexuality all that much. You know what I mean? As in, I had maybe thought of myself within the terms of, am I gay or am I straight, or within those parameters. But I'd never really thought about being sexual. And I think one interesting thing that I hope that this series and the conversation that's begun about asexuality, what I hope that will spark is that people will start questioning, why are we so, in our hyper kind of sexualized society, why are we so quick to assume that to be human means to be sexual? And I think that's one thing that the asexual community and also this series is trying to kind of question.
How big is this community?
I think David J would be able to answer that question more directly, but go ahead, David.
Right now, if you look across our whole international community, so people who speak English, French, German, Portuguese, Mandarin, we're at about 70,000 people.
Wow, that's unbelievable, Micah. We didn't get to you and hear your story and how you came to label yourself. Tell us how you came to label yourself as asexual, the journey that you went on.
Well, I also kind of try to make up words like IV, but I would say I'm asexual or like a robot in high school, and I just very clearly didn't like anyone. And people at the end would even ask me, are you gay? And I'm like, well, if I were gay, I would at least like, the same sex. But I don't even like that. So I would say I was asexual. Then when I was 18, I just Googled asexuality and found AVEN, asexuality.org, and that was it. I kind of found my home. But I think one interesting part about discovering asexuality as opposed to like discovering being gay is that when you're gay, you have this attraction. It's just misdirected to what you don't expect. Whereas here, it's very hard to find a lack of something.
Interesting. Lori, you've done a lot of research on asexuality, and there's a lot of misconceptions of where asexuality comes from. I mean, you do reading, even in your posts. One of the main misconceptions is that this is something that people choose to be, and then there's several other people who say, why would anyone choose to not have sex? Why would anyone choose to not feel sexual feelings for anyone? So, Lori, I'm curious what some of the main takeaways of your research have been.
So, well, we've been really interested in just trying to understand who are asexuals, and secondly, we've been much more interested in looking at what leads one to become asexual. And some of the things we've found, well, first of all, just to debunk some of the myths that are out there, I think one of the prevailing myths is that this is a choice, that this is celibacy, that this is some kind of manifestation of an early childhood trauma or psychiatric illness or something else. And we've carried out a number of studies now so far, and on the whole, asexuals really don't differ all that much in terms of mental well-being, past histories of abuse, trauma, etc. There's really no indicator in their early life that something has caused them to be asexual. And we've also been doing more research looking at kind of some of the more biological markers, some of the markers that are well known in the homosexual research. And we're finding some of those same markers in asexuals. So again, pointing to the idea that this is, people they're born this way.
Why have people for so long considered it a disorder?
Well, I don't know if it's that people for so long have, but certainly among the clinical community, and as a clinical psychologist, I often rub shoulders with those folks. And it's because we tend to treat people who come to see us because they're bothered by their low level of sexual desire or interest. But we're very used to identifying low desire, lack of interest, treating it, helping people move on. And asexuality is really quite different from individuals who are sexual but have lost their sexual desire and want to gain it back. And I think that whole idea that these are really two different groups, they're not the same group. There may be some areas of overlap between the two groups, but in my mind and from the research we've done, these are really distinct groups. And so that's just quite a novel sort of idea for many clinicians in this field.
I think overlap is kind of a key word here for this next question. David, you were talking about the sexuality spectrum in terms of being asexual. Can you tell me where you fall on the spectrum and sort of where other people within the ace community fall on the spectrum that you've come into contact with?
Yeah, so I identify as asexual and panromantic, the leaning more towards heteromantic, which means that I experience romantic attraction, if not sexual attraction, and I have a romantic partner who's also asexual. Other people on the spectrum will identify as gray A. Those are people who are sort of between sexual and asexual. And people also identify as demisexual. Demisexual people experience sexual attraction, but only in the context of a close partnership.
Okay, David. So I'm curious, and I'm going to have to ask these questions because I know viewers are curious about them.
Ahead.
So you have a romantic partner that you share intimacy with, but you do not, as both of you as asexual people, you do not have sexual relationships, sexual relations. Such a corny term. Sorry, sound like a presidential figure.
What I'll say is that one of the really amazing things about being in a relationship with another asexual person is that both of us really like touch. Both of us really like affectionate touch. And there's ways that we are able to explore touch together that we've never been able to explore it with a sexual partner. Because we're kind of, our bodies work in a similar way. So there's a lot of ways of being intimate with someone, physically, emotionally, in conversation, by doing amazing creative work together, that don't involve sexuality. And one of the really cool things about our community is that we're able to come together and really talk about and explore those kinds of intimacy. Mm-hmm. Rather than, I think, a lot of us start from the assumption that if you're not being sexual, you're not being intimate. And we all kind of know on a basic level that's not true. And our community is really about helping people explore and celebrate how we're going to be intimate in a way that makes sense for us as asexual people.
I agree. I don't think that you have to be sexual to be intimate, but I'm curious what you mean when you say exploring touch. Those sound, I mean, how do you define sexuality? How do you define sex? Because sex doesn't have to be the specific kind of, it doesn't have to be intercourse. There are different kinds of sexuality, sexual approaches to sexuality. So, I mean, exploring touch to me sounds like a somewhat sexual act.
So I because of agreeing with my partner, won't go into the specifics of like physically what we do. I'll say that
understandable.
Right. I'll say that we like cuddling a lot, and and at some point you can get into an arbitrary definition of what someone considers sexuality and what doesn't when labeling different kinds of touch. I think for us, it's not useful to label the things that we're doing that way.
Micah, you have. I'm just gonna. Micah, you have a kind of a smirk on your face. I think you want to jump in here. Go ahead.
Well, Ivy said I like massages, and I like them too. And I think that goes into your question of what is the difference between touch and sex, and kind of the way asexuals have sex. And I've been in a partnered relationship for 6.5 years, and my partner does not identify as asexual. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the difference is not, do asexuals have sex? Because some do, and it feels good, and it's something very physical most of the time. And I think the disconnect is in, ask my friends, kind of the foreplay, right? You start with a massage and it turns sexual. And I think for us, a massage is just a massage. And there's never that emotional connection between sex and my emotional intimacy with my partner. And I think that's where the difference is that sexuality is not a crucial part of my relationship, and it doesn't influence or dictate my emotional intimacy with my partner and my emotional closeness that I experience.
Julie, I feel like you wanted to jump in here too. The three of you probably have personal experiences regarding this conversation. So Julie, go ahead.
Oh, well, I'm aromantic, and I don't have relationships, and I'm not really a touchy-feely person at all, but that is different from being touch-repulsed. I'm not touch-repulsed. I like massages as well. That's really all I have to add on that, though.
I think we're all in agreement that massages are great. I mean, no one here is against massages.
Right. But for an asexual, a massage is always going to be a massage. And for a lot of people, that kind of has a sexual connotation, that it'll lead to something more. So sometimes touch is just touch, and it feels nice, and it's just the physical experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and a lot of it is the trust, and that becomes intimacy of letting someone touch you.
Mm-hmm. Dominique, you wanted to jump in a minute ago?
I think Mike has put it very well, but I was just going to talk about this couple that I interviewed for this series, Isaac and Katie. They're both asexuals and they're in a romantic relationship. And, one question I asked them was, I think a lot of our readers will read about two asexuals being in a relationship and will ask, how is that different from a friendship? And this kind of goes beyond what you asked about, about the sex in a relationship. But I think, their answer was, well, there is commitment there beyond a friendship. And they talked about, and the intimacy that David J. referred to. And I think when they talked about touch and how that was important to their relationship as well, they said, well, for instance, we may enjoy like lying close to one another in a way that you wouldn't really do with your friend. You want that closeness, you want that commitment that you may not have in a friendship.
Well, jumping off of sex here, I think one of the other questions about being asexual is masturbation. And do people who are asexual masturbate? How often do they masturbate? Is it the same? If they do masturbate, are they sexual people? Does masturbating necessarily mean being sexual? David, I'm gonna throw this one to you.
Great, and then I'm going to throw it shortly to Lori because she's done some excellent research on this. So we know that the quick answer, which Lori can back up, is that we know that asexual people are as likely to have tried masturbation as sexual people. I believe that's right, Lori. And it does not change how you identify. The real criteria for whether or not you're asexual is whether you find the word asexual useful to describe yourself. And what we found is that if someone doesn't experience sexual attraction, that has a pretty fundamental impact on how they form relationships with other people, how other people see them, and it's kind of a big enough deal that you need an identity to think about. If someone masturbates or doesn't masturbate, it doesn't really impact their lives on the level that they need an identity. It changes their identity. So many asexual people masturbate and enjoy it. Many others don't. It's not really something that is seen as a source of division in the community.
Lori, I want to take this to you in a second, but there's a quote here that says, when you talk about masturbation, you may think of it as a sexual activity, but actually masturbation is not inherently sexual. Asexuals cite boredom, stress reduction, helping them get to sleep, etc. are reasons behind masturbation. I am not asexual, and I would cite those reasons for masturbation as well, very easily.
I was just going to add that I don't think that the sexual community really differs in the reasons for masturbation any more than the asexuals do. And so we did find that many of the asexuals that we interviewed, as well as that we gave online questionnaires to, said that they had masturbated at some point. There were some of those individuals who continued to masturbate on a very regular basis. But when we followed it up and actually talked to them in the course of interviews and had them describe to us what it was like for them and what kind of the contents of their thoughts were while they were masturbating, they really described it in a very non-sexual way. So many of them described it as, quote, cleaning the plumbing. It's like an itch that needs to be scratched. It helps me get to sleep, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think there's a real danger in looking at masturbation and saying that that's inherently sexual, that if one masturbates, that questions their identity as being asexual.
I completely agree. I can't imagine most people turning off the lights, lighting the candles, setting a romantic environment for masturbation. It is more of a utility. I mean, am I wrong? I'm going to take this to Julie. I think I'm digging a hole for myself here. I'm going to let Julie take over on this one.
No, I think you're right. I think that it would be wrong to say, well, you do this, so that means that you must be thinking about something sexually. I think also it's important to note that plenty of people who do not identify as asexual do masturbate and don't find it to be a substitute for seeking partnered sex. So there you go.
Mm-hmm.
Micah, you're nodding. Do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I think what Lori brought up is it's what people are thinking when they're doing it. And I've found that asexuals, they don't fantasize while they do it because it's just a very kind of physical need. It's an act. It's like you're just satisfying this drive that you have. You're not really connecting it to another person or to an emotion.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting using the word drive, because I think some people would jump on that word and say, oh, so you have a sex drive. But you're saying that there's a disconnect between other people and what would be considered a sex drive.
Absolutely. Asexuals have sex drive. And the analogy that I use, which might not be the best, but it works, is like the difference between hunger and appetite. Because sometimes you're really, really hungry, but if you're sick, you might not want to eat anything because you have no appetite. Versus sometimes you have this like huge chocolate cake in front of you and you just ate and you're full, but you really, really just want to have that chocolate cake. And that's hunger and appetite. One is a drive and one is a desire to eat something connected with an emotional experience.
Lori, I know you have to get out of here. Do you want to say anything before you leave, either in regards to this specific part of the topic or anything else in regards to asexuality before you have to leave?
Well, something I think that's relevant to the whole masturbation topic, and maybe is relevant to another myth that's out there, which is, maybe asexuality is just a sexual dysfunction. Maybe these are folks who have problems with sexual response and they adapt in a way that they will close off everything sexual. And so we and some others have actually tested that. We've brought asexuals into our lab. We've hooked them up to genital measures. We've shown them erotic films, and guess what? They respond in the same way that sexual individuals do. So there's no impairment in the body's ability to become sexual that's explaining their asexual identity.
Wow. David, when people come to you and say that they're asexual, what sort of support are people looking for that they haven't had until they've sort of come out?
So most of the time when people come to me, or when they come to our community for the first time, they don't know if they're asexual or not. They'll sort of say, I have this big bundle of life experiences. I've spent my life kind of not really been able to relate to the sexual world around me, or having everyone expect me to be something that I'm not. And what does that mean? Am I asexual? And what we'll say to them is, if the word asexual makes sense to you, then use it. It's a tool, not a label. If it ever stops making sense, then stop using it. And everyone in the community will celebrate that, which we do. And the support we offer, we have an online community where people come and they'll tell stories about their asexual identity and be able to share those stories with other people who can relate to them. We also have a number of offline meetup groups that get together to do that in person. We're right now planning, actually tomorrow, to have our biggest conference of the year in the US for Pride. I've got our t-shirts right here, which say, man delights not in me, no, nor women neither. And so we'll have events like that.
So you are doing stuff. You guys are doing stuff for Gay Pride Week, meaning that, do you feel like asexuality should fit under the LGBT umbrella? I mean, we have a Twitter comment right here that said, queer is the umbrella term for lifestyles outside of #heteronormativity. So do you feel like, asexuality should be under the LGBT umbrella? LGBTQ, excuse me.
I'll say personally, I identify as queer. I know many asexual people, including many aces, many people in the ace leadership, asexual, gay, and demi, also all identify as queer. And there's always been a really strong overlap with that movement, because that's where the discussion about human sexual diversity is happening. And because so many people in our community identify also with that community. And also because it's where a lot of political fights, like marriage equality, like fighting against violence against the transgender community, sort of fights that we're invested in are happening. So there's a lot of overlap. We're very active participants. There's also members of our community who don't identify with that community, and we want to respect that.
I mean, there's a comment coming in here in regards to this, and remember, it's not me. It's one of our commenters, and I'll take this to you, Dominique. Natty Morgan says, come on, man, at what point does all of this dilute struggles of gay and lesbian people? Why does that seem to be a common misconception about the asexual community joining the LGBTQ?
I mean, first I'll go back a little bit and say that there is a reason why this feature sits under Gay Voices and not under a different section in the Huff Post. I mean, we believe that, Gay Voices, is dedicated to all members of the LGBTQ community, and that includes kind of the main groups, you know, gays, lesbians, bisexual, transgender people, but it also includes other groups that don't necessarily fit so neatly into those categories. So we're dedicated to polyamorous individuals, asexuals, genderqueer individuals, and we believe that, you know, queer liberation is all about kind of providing a space for people who don't fit within, as the Twitter user said earlier.
Heteronormativity.
The heteronormative kind of model. And we believe that the LGBTQ community should be supporting groups that are marginalized, like asexuals, who I think in our future we kind of show that it is a marginalized group. And so I think comments like that are common, and I think it's important to ask those questions. But a lot of asexuals who I spoke to for the feature stress that, you know, they're not trying to undermine the experiences that gays have experienced before. And many say that, you know, the gays have had it worst of all, right? I mean, through the last century, the past century, it's like, you know, so many people were killed, and there continues to be so much violence against members of the LGBT community. So there's no, it's not a desire to undermine that at all, but to kind of add to the conversation. And I think it's important that the groups don't undermine each other and instead kind of bolster each other up.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the persecution of the LGBT community, right? Because what I think is so interesting about asexual, and Julie, I want to turn this to you, is when we talk about persecution, it's hard for me to imagine. I'm going to find a way to put this. It's hard for me to imagine people in the asexual community being persecuted, because essentially you are not necessarily holding hands while walking. You're not sort of showcasing a relationship of some kind, whereas in the LGBT community, acceptance is about a gay man being able to walk down the street holding his partner's hands, or a lesbian being able, or trans, someone being able to sort of be out and in public about it. Whereas it seems to me to be out and in public about being asexual, it would have to be a kind of conversation almost. You would have to be talking to someone and be okay with telling them, rather than just sort of walking down the street and being pointed at as being asexual. Julie, have you ever faced persecution or discrimination as a person, as someone who is asexual?
I would say that nothing that I've experienced is institutional oppression. I would say that, first of all, asexual people are not trying to create a hierarchy of whose oppression is worse, but we do experience some invisible discrimination, and I think a lot of people are not really positioned to even be able to see it, first of all. They expected that asexuality would look like nothing, but when you actually are not engaging in the kinds of relationships or having relationships that don't look like what the norm is, people do ask questions, and they start to doubt whether you actually belong as one of us, and being excluded as not one of us, not being human, not really being an adult, all of those things. People will treat you like you're different if you clearly are. And it's not just a question either of being different. Oh, somebody said something bad to me. There have been established cases of, say, adoption denials, people getting fired over not engaging in the sexual conversation because that's what all the coworkers are doing, and that one over there is a prude, etc. And on top of that, you do have to recognize that a really huge percentage of the asexual community does identify as transgender or gay or both. They may be an LGBT identity as well as asexual. So,
I mean, it's unfortunate that someone would experience those things, obviously. And I think what's interesting, something that I thought of while you were talking about this, is sort of in the workroom while people are having sex or something. If someone were to come over to a group of people in the office and say, "Oh, guys, I'm asexual," I can imagine the majority of people, when they walked away, being like, what does that mean? What do you mean they're asexual? And it's this thing that you're doing such a great job of in putting this piece out there, is getting people more open-minded to this community. Was that sort of one of your initiatives in publishing this?
Definitely. I mean, we're talking about discrimination right now. We have a whole piece on asexual discrimination and that I just pulled up. And, you know, one thing that was very interesting that David J. told me when I met him a few months ago was that very few asexuals are out right now, is kind of what we can maybe assume, because there's so little information out there about asexuality that probably a lot of asexuals are still not out, and we, they still haven't identified as asexual. And last year there was a study that came out of Canada's Brock University that looked at the possible discrimination that asexuals would face if they were out in the world, right? And what they found was that people of all sexual stripes were more likely to discriminate against asexual people than people of other sexual minorities. So for example, a straight person was more likely to discriminate against an asexual person than a gay person, which was very interesting. And
I think it's just lack of understanding.
Lack of understanding.
It's because they don't understand something. It's not, it's the same as 20 years ago when someone said they were gay in the office and people were like, what is that? People would whisper about it. Now it's like, okay.
Right, exactly. And I also think that asexual people, because we don't have this conversation about, how asexuality might exist in this very sexual society that we live in. Asexuals are seen, according to the study anyway, as sort of less human, mechanistic, because again, like I feel like sex is often seen as part of what makes us human, you know, in this society. So. Yeah.
Well, guys, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. Dominique, thank you for writing the piece and for joining me. And guys, Dominique's piece is in the resource well. The 6-part series on Huff Post Gay Voices about being asexual is in the resource well. Do check it out. It's a fantastic, extensive piece about asexuality. David, Julie, Lori, Micah, thanks so much for joining me and sharing your personal stories. I really appreciate it. And so does Huff Post Live. There's a lot more coming up next. Mike Sachs is sitting over there on the couch waiting to give you your noon news. I'm Ricky Camilleri, and this is Huff Post Live.